Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I have a clean and simple card to share with you using masking. So let's get started. This is the adorable Hang Out and Celebrate stamp set from the July 2023 release. It's absolutely adorable. I love those sloths. So I've taken the sloth that's hanging on the branch and also the sentiment that reads, let's hang out and celebrate soon. And I'm going to stamp them down onto a panel of white cardstock. This is cut to 3.5 inches by 4 3/4 inches. And I'm stamping them towards the top of the panel, but trying to have them kind of middle, if that makes sense. And so I'm stamping that twice with black ink just to make sure that I get a really nice dark impression. And then I'm going to stamp them onto some masking paper. So I don't like to re-ink the stamp at this point. I like to have the masks quite light in ink. This is just in case the ink doesn't dry completely on the masking paper. I mean, by the time I cut it out, it is definitely going to have dried, but just on the off chance it doesn't, I don't want to blend any of that black ink onto my panel. So now I can cut out this image using scissors, and when I do masking I like to cut on the line or even just inside of the line if possible. I definitely don't want to cut on the outside of the line, because if you do that sometimes you can kind of get like a white halo. I'm going to go around this with ink blending, which is the purpose of doing the masking, so I can have it all one layer. If you didn't want to do masking, you can definitely just die cut the image out with the coordinating dynamics and that would look lovely, but I wanted it to be all one layer, and that's why the masking kind of comes into play here. So I'm just taking my time. I'm trying to move the masking paper rather than the scissors, and that's how I personally like to fussy cut. I think I get a better kind of look that way, or cut I should say, by doing that. I'm not going to go around the balloon string because that doesn't matter if I add ink blending on top, so I can just completely cut that off and then cut around the rest of the image. And then for the balloon I'm just going to cut that out as a separate image. I can then remove the backing off of the masking paper, and then I can pop that down onto the panel over the image. And as I'm adding this down, you can see that you can still see those stamped lines from the image, and that's kind of what I'm going for. So like I said, so when I add the ink blending on top, the masking paper is not going to cover any of that background if possible. Sometimes it does happen, and I did get a little bit extra sort of on one of his feet, but it was so tiny that I didn't try and correct that. But you could definitely go around the outside edge again with some ink, kind of like mask it, or you could just cover that up with a Copic marker or something like that. I'm then taking some Blue Beyond ink and a mini ink blending brush, and I am removing most of the ink off of this brush because I want this kind of first layer to be really quite pale, and this is a very vibrant blue. It's beautiful, but it is quite vibrant. So I'm going around the outside edges of this image here. So I kind of start on the image and then work my way out. And so I want the blue to kind of fade to white basically, so that it's just going to kind of imply that there's a background even though there isn't necessarily, if that makes sense. So I'm just going around the outside edges of the image here. I've run out of ink on my brush, so I'm just going to do the same thing, add a little bit to the brush, remove a lot of the excess ink, and then go back in with that brush. You can definitely dab off the excess ink onto the lid of the ink pad, and that way you can reuse it if you wanted to, but I do find that I get a better blend if I go on to scrap paper. I'm not sure why, but that's just how it happens to work for me. So I do waste a little bit of the ink, but it's not a huge amount. I then want to intensify that colour slightly, so this time I'm removing a little bit less ink off of that brush, and I'm just really going into those little areas just where the image meets that background. So just kind of intensifying the colour a little bit there, and I'm focusing most of this kind of slightly darker shade towards the bottom of the image. Then once I'm happy with the ink blending, I can carefully remove the mask, and I'm doing this carefully purely so that I can reuse this mask if I wanted to. If I've taken the time to make a mask, then my ideal aim is to keep it so that I can reuse it if I want to. The ink blending is not strong enough on the top that is going to bleed through like straight away, so I can reuse this a couple of times if I want to. So as I remove this, I'm going to pop it on the packaging of the stamp set so that I can keep it with the set if I want to use it again. So then I can just carefully remove that balloon piece as well. I'm then going to colour the image with Copic markers. I personally prefer to, if I'm doing masking and ink blending, to do all of that first and then go in with the colouring. You can definitely do it the other way around, but for me, I think that the quickest thing is the ink blending. So if I mess up the ink blending, I've only got to get to this point in time again if I want to redo it. But if I did all of the colouring and then messed up the ink blending, I've got to redo all the colouring as well. So that's why I do it in this way. Obviously I can mess up the colouring and then I've got to redo it, but I still think it's probably quicker if I do it this way around. So I'm starting off by colouring in the branch. So I started off with my darkest shade, which was E59, blended that out with the E57, and then now I'm going in with the E55 to blend that out further. Then for the sloth, I'm using some kind of more muted browns. So I'm starting off by mapping out my darkest areas using the E49 marker. And I'm thinking that the light source is kind of more towards the kind of top left hand corner. I'm not doing this as a precise sort of one side is darker, one side is lighter. I'm just doing it where I think would be slightly darker and slightly lighter. I don't try to focus too much on light source. I know that is a good way to colour in the images and it does make them a little bit more cohesive, but sometimes I just like to enjoy colouring. So I'm blending that colour out with the E47. And I'm just figuring out here, like I do stop occasionally just to see where I've coloured, see where I might want to add a little bit more colour in. And then I can blend that out with the E44. So just bringing up that colour on his back and then going around his face as well. And I'm thinking that the bottom of his face would be darker than the top part. I'm then going in with E43 and blending that out further, filling in the top of his face there. And then for the top part of the body, I'm going to bring in E42. And then I'm going to go back for the lightest parts of the face using E43, blend that out with the E42, and then I can blend that out with the lightest shade, which is E41. I'm then going to go back in for the darker areas around his eyes using E47, E44, and then I can blend that out with the E43. And he's just got the cutest little smile, hasn't he? Then for the leaves on the branch, I'm going in with my darkest shade first, which is G29. Just adding that towards the bottom of the leaves. And I find it easier sometimes just to move the cardstock. I sometimes prefer to flick colour sort of downwards rather than sideways, so that's why I'm moving the cardstock. I blended that out with the YG17 and then I'm using YG23 to blend that out further. And then for the lightest shade, I'm using YG01. So just finishing those little tips of the leaves there. And then it's not a colour that I use very often, but I thought I would use yellow for the hat and the balloon. So I'm starting off with my darkest shade, which is Y17. And then for the balloon, I'm adding kind of like a highlight at the bottom and at the top, and this is quite a good way to colour in images that you want to look round, because there would kind of be like a bit of a highlight on all of the sides, if that makes sense. So I used the Y17 for that, and then I'm blending it out now with the Y15 followed by the Y13, and then I'm going to go in with my lightest shade, which is Y11. And for that, I'm just going around the outside edges of that balloon and the top little kind of fuzzy part on the hat as well. And then just to kind of sharpen up that line a little bit on the balloon, I'm going back in with the darkest shade. So the Y17, the Y15 and the Y13. I then want to kind of try and bring in that yellow a little bit more. So I'm taking the Wood Grain Whimsy 6x6 paper pad, and I'm going to use this as a background around the panel. So I'm adding some adhesive onto an A2 size white card base. So this is a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. If I'm adhering patterned paper onto a card base, I like to add the adhesive onto the card base and then add the paper on top and have the paper be bigger than I actually need it to be. So then I can cut off the excess, but there's no adhesive on the back of it, so I can save that for another project. So just aligning those two up as best as possible, and then I can go in and cut off the excess from the two sides. And then I do like to go around the outside edges with the bone folder just to make sure that that patterned paper is really well stuck down. I've then added some thin foam tape onto the back of the panel, and I can pop that down onto the card. And then to finish off, I'm adding some white little dots with a gel pen. This is a 0.8 gel pen. So I'm just kind of adding some sort of random-ish dots around the image. I tend to go in threes and then add in a couple of extra. And then just adding a few highlights onto the images as well. So I tend to sort of draw a line and then a little dot or two dots. And that is the card finished for today. I really like how that masking turned out. I think the masking technique works particularly well with images where you don't necessarily want like a full background, but you want it to kind of look a little bit like there is something there and your eyes would kind of fill in the rest, if that makes sense. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.